All right, so picture this for a second, because what I'm about to tell you is honestly wild. Imagine being a woman dragged into a naval courtroom in the 1700s, a place built by men, run by men, and judged by men who straight up believed that piracy wasn't just a crime for a woman, it was unnatural. From the moment she stepped inside, the deck was already stacked against her. No jury, no real defense, no mercy. Just a cold room, a handful of officers glaring down at her, and a verdict that was basically decided before she even opened her mouth. And the crazy part? This wasn't some rare scenario. During the golden age of piracy, when the seas were crawling with outlaws and the British Empire was flexing its power, the few women who dared to sail alongside crews of men didn't just break the law, they shattered the gender rules of the entire world they lived in. That alone made them twice as dangerous in the eyes of the admiralty courts. You had women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read standing in front of those judges in 1720, knowing full well the courtroom wasn't there to hear their story, it was there to end it. And the punishments? Man, they were brutal. Hangings at execution dock where the crowd came out like it was some twisted public event. Floggings meant to humiliate more than punish. Women forced into slavery or concubinage and others left to rot on disease-ridden prison ships until their names literally disappeared from history. And that's the real heart of the story, not just how these women lived, but how the world made sure they wouldn't be remembered. Their fates were designed to scare people, to erase them, to send a message that the empire, not freedom, not the sea, had the final word. But here's where things get absolutely insane. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that their punishments weren't just about piracy. They were about power, gender, and who gets written into history and who gets written out.
The naval courtroom wasn't a place of justice. It was a stage, and every woman who walked into it was already cast as the villain. Picture the scene. A dim colonial chamber in Jamaica or New Providence, officers in stiff uniforms staring down from a raised bench, the air thick with humidity and judgment. These weren't ordinary courts. They operated without juries, without safeguards, without any real chance for a fair hearing. They were machines built to convict. And for women, the bias was multiplied. The very men who wrote the laws believed piracy was something a woman shouldn't even be capable of. So when a female pirate was dragged inside, she wasn't just accused of breaking maritime law. She was treated as someone who had broken the natural order itself. The verdicts came fast, and the sentences were brutal. Witnesses were often terrified sailors, pressured captains, and naval officers who already knew exactly what the court wanted to hear. Testimonies weren't about truth. They were about confirming the narrative the Admiralty had already decided, that women who dared to sail, fight, and command were dangerous exceptions that needed to be crushed. Anne Bonny and Mary Read walked into that world in 2020, chained, exhausted, and facing judges who saw them as an insult to the empire. When the court condemned Calico Jack, Anne's infamous line wasn't just anger. It was a reminder that even in that courtroom, she refused to break. Their only shield? A loophole called pleading the belly, claiming pregnancy to delay execution. It bought them time, nothing more. For most women, even that thin protection didn't exist. In these makeshift tribunals, justice wasn't blind. It was weaponized, and every woman who stood there knew the truth.
If the courtroom was the sentence, execution dock was the spectacle. At dawn, the streets of London would already be filling. Shopkeepers, sailors, children perched on their parents' shoulders, everyone eager to watch pirates. And for the British Empire, that was the whole point. These executions weren't quiet acts of justice. They were public theater designed to terrify. From Newgate prison, the condemned were paraded through the city in an open cart, shackled, exhausted, surrounded by armed guards as crowds hurled insults or pressed forward just to get a better look. By the time they reached the waterfront at the tide was rolling in. The gallows waited, and there was no mistaking the message. This is what happens when you defy the empire. Unlike land executions, the Admiralty didn't use the long drop. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, pirates died by slow strangulation, their bodies jerking and writhing in what executioners called the marshal's dance. It could take minutes, sometimes longer. And although female pirate pirate executions were fewer, they were no softer. Women like Mary Critchett, captured near Virginia in 1729, weren't granted mercy, delay, or sympathy. She was sentenced, she was hanged, and history barely bothered to write her name down. The worst offenders, usually men, but the threat extended to women too, were left hanging until 3 tides washed over their bodies. Gibbeting, a final humiliation, a final warning. At execution dock, gender didn't save you. Not reputation, not fear, not bravery. In the shadow of the gallows, female pirates stopped being legends and became lessons. Their stories weren't just ended, they were displayed.
The courtroom smelled of salt water, sweat, and fear. But the fear didn't belong to the judges, the clerks, or the British officers. It belonged to the prisoners, especially the women, who the law had already decided were unnatural, deviant, and unfit to exist as free people. As the female pirates were brought in, the room did not see sailors. It saw spectacles, curiosities, wicked women who dared to step outside the roles society assigned them. Before the trial even began, the outcome was practically sealed. The British Admiralty courts prided themselves on efficiency, and efficiency meant guilty until proven innocent. And for women, innocence was rarely even considered. Magistrates whispered, how could a woman even wield a cutlass? How could she command men? How could she live on a ship without moral decay? Every question was a trap. Every assumption was a rope tightening around their neck. And as the charges were read, piracy, theft, murder, rebellion against the crown, the courtroom waited for one thing, for the women to break. But the pirates did not bow. Some glared, some smirked, some stood with a defiance that shook the room, because they knew the truth. This wasn't a trial, it was an execution, wrapped in legal language, delivered by men who feared women with freedom more than pirates with swords.
All right, so now we move from the courtroom to the streets, where punishment became public theater. Before the noose, many female pirates faced the cat-o'-nine-tails, the infamous whip designed to tear flesh and instill terror. And for women, this was about more than punishment. It was about spectacle, humiliation, and control. The authorities wanted everyone watching to understand what happened when a woman dared to take command of a ship or fire a pistol. Imagine the scene: a crowded dock, salt in the air, kids craning their necks, sailors shouting, townsfolk leaning over fences, all staring at a woman forced to endure excruciating lashes. Each strike was calculated, a brutal punctuation to the crime she'd committed in the eyes of the empire. Punishments ranged from a dozen lashes to over 100, depending on the so-called severity of the offense and the whims of the court. Blood mingled with the salt air and cobblestones, and the women were meant to be both object lesson and warning. Even Anne Bonny and Mary Read, before their trial, were reportedly kept in horrific conditions by Jamaican authorities. While there's no record that they were flogged during imprisonment, female pirates elsewhere in the Americas or Caribbean colonies routinely faced this torture, either to extract confessions or to terrify onlookers. The goal was clear. These women had dared to lead, fight, and defy expectations. They had to be broke physically and symbolically in front of everyone. The flogging wasn't justice. It was theater. It was control. And it was terrifyingly effective. Everyone on the dock, man, woman, or child, witnessed a brutal truth. The empire would bend you to its will, and it didn't matter if you were a man or a woman.
Not every captured female pirate met the gallows. In some cases, particularly in colonial ports across the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Americas, women faced a different kind of horror. They were stripped of freedom and forced into concubinage, coerced labor, or outright slavery. Unlike the dramatic spectacle of a hanging or flogging, this fate was quieter, but no less brutal. The records are scarce, and historians admit that much of this erasure was deliberate. Women aboard pirate ships, especially those of African or indigenous descent, could be treated as spoils of war. In Spanish and Portuguese colonies, archives from Portobello and Cartagena describe women captured from pirate ships being processed as property, often with no distinction between their role as crewmates or captives. Once taken, they could be sold, assigned to plantation work, or forced into the households of colonial officials. Even women of European descent weren't entirely safe. Their value might have been different, but the principle was the same. Submission was mandatory. Gender, race, and the arbitrary whims of colonial powers dictated their fate. Their stories were overwritten by ownership, erasing names, identities, and lives from history, not through execution, but through a slow, systematic disappearance. For these women, capture did not mean a swift death at the gallows. It meant disappearing into a world of servitude and coercion, where survival came at the cost of autonomy and dignity. Their voices were silenced, their agency stripped away, and their legacy, in many cases, left to fade quietly in the shadows of empire. And here's the kicker. The threat of slavery or concubinage served as a powerful tool. It reminded anyone watching that piracy wasn't just a crime of theft. For a woman, it was a crime that could erase your entire existence.
For some captured female pirates, death didn't come quickly at the gallows or in chains on a dock. Instead, it came slowly, silently, and out of sight aboard the rotting hulks of prison ships. These floating prisons, anchored off colonial coasts or British harbors, were never meant to hold people for long. But as jails overflowed in the 18th century, they became grim holding pens for pirates, rebels, and anyone deemed an enemy of the crown, including women. Conditions aboard these ships were nightmarish. Shackled below deck in cramped, dark, and unventilated holds, prisoners faced disease, starvation, and filth. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox spread like wildfire. Spoiled food and stagnant water became the norm, and for women, vulnerability doubled. They were exposed not just to illness, but to exploitation, abuse, and neglect, a terrifying reality rarely recorded in official accounts. Historical records often ignored the suffering of women, leaving them invisible. On these decks, executions weren't celebrated or documented. Their deaths were erased, leaving only silence behind. No crowd, no spectacle, no memory preserved. The empire made sure these women could be forgotten as easily as they had been captured. Prison ships became instruments of fear and control. They were reminders that defying the maritime world's rules, especially as a woman, could strip you of identity, rights, and recognition. In the shadows of these decaying vessels, countless female pirates met fates designed not just to punish, but to erase. And yet, even in silence, their stories echo. They remind us of the stakes, the cruelty, and the lengths to which empires would go to maintain power and to erase women who defied it.
So here's the thing. The story of female pirates doesn't just end at the gallows, the whipping post, or the prison ship. Their legacy is complicated, marked by both rebellion and erasure. For every Anne Bonny or Mary Read whose name survived, countless women disappeared from the records, swallowed by empire and time. Their punishments weren't only about law or justice. They were instruments of fear, gendered power, and imperial control. When historians dig into archives, they see fragments, mentions of women sold into bondage, left to rot on prison ships, or executed without fanfare. Their lives were often reduced to footnotes, their stories told only through the eyes of the men who captured them. And yet, even in absence, their impact resonates. These women challenged norms, took to the sea, and proved that courage and defiance didn't belong solely to men. Their erasure raises uncomfortable questions. Who gets remembered? Who gets judged? Who gets erased entirely? And perhaps most importantly, what does this say about power and justice in a world built by men for men? The seas they sailed, the battles they fought, and the punishment they endured remind us that history is often written by the victors, and that some voices are silenced deliberately. In the end, the story of female pirates isn't just about crime and punishment. It's about survival, defiance, and the shadowed corners of history where women fought, suffered, and sometimes were deliberately forgotten. And even centuries later, their courage continues to echo in the silent waves, daring us to ask whose stories get told and whose are lost forever.